Hello everybody and welcome to the first episode of the Fantasy Workbench, a little series that I'm putting together of short sessions aimed at aspiring writers to really help them with their craft, to tighten that world building, that character development and all of those things that really make your story sparkle. I would like to be able to see you through, all the way through from initial concept up until publication and beyond. So, I've got a question for you. Do you fancy yourself a writer? Or perhaps you're already a writer who just wants to tighten their craft slightly, who wants a few tips, a few ideas. Perhaps you're just a fantasy reader who wants to have a little bit more information behind the door, behind the emerald curtain, how it's made. My name is McClellan Morwood, and this is the Fantasy Workbench. In this first episode, we're going to be considering the various subgenres of fantasy and why it might be important to consider these at the very beginning of you creating your initial concept. So, a situation that we often find ourselves in, you've come up with the most amazingly unique premise for a fantasy story. You simply cannot wait to get it down on paper. But a really important question that I have to ask you is this: what kind of world are you going to set your story in? Now, this could be an amazingly easy question for you to answer. It might be something that you've had in your head from the very beginning. It might be incredibly integral to your concept. Or it might be something that you're only just now scratching your head and thinking, oh, I didn't really think about that. Maybe I should give it some thought. Some fantasy ideas are so perfect for some worlds that your fantasy story might be set in. Other concepts might completely fall flat in others. So today we're going to be looking at them, the three main types, and we're going to be considering the pros and cons of each and throwing a few examples in there as well at the same time. So, the first subgenre which I tend to think of for fantasy is high fantasy. This is fantasy which takes place in a made-up, fictional world where various things might be different to our own reality, such as animals and plants present, the rules of physics in regard to magic or flight, for example, and the races which exist. Many fantasy staples, such as wizards, dwarfs, elves and goblins, are often present in high fantasy, sometimes with a detailed backstory and origin mythos. Examples of high fantasy are Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, taking place in the fictional world of Middle-earth, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, which takes place primarily on the fictional continent of Westeros, and Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. Another setting which could be utilised is our own world. Largely the same, and could sometimes be passed off as happening without our knowledge, almost like a secret in our everyday world. This is called low fantasy, and in the case where it takes place in the modern day, is called contemporary fantasy. Examples of contemporary fantasy are J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series, and Owen Colfer's Artemis Fowl series, because they take place in current day modern Earth. And there are also legends such as King Arthur and even some old fairy tales such as Pinocchio that can be considered examples of low fantasy, which instead of being set in current day are set in our own past. There is a third setting which may be chosen, that of a parallel world to our own or alternate history where many similarities exist, such as geography, but with key differences which are often a focus of the narrative. This can also include worlds within our worlds, which we'll talk about more in a few moments. Examples of fantasy stories which take place in a parallel world are Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials and C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which, as I said before, is an example of a world within a world. at least as presented in the first novel, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, as Narnia in that book is reached through the titular wardrobe, which is in our world. We then come to many curious examples of settings which are mixtures and combinations of two or all three of these options. For example, His Dark Materials takes place in multiple parallel worlds, but also in our own, therefore carrying elements of contemporary fantasy, as well as the benefits of utilising a fictional world, being able to have such things as talking polar bears and witches. Narnia is a world within a world, as it is within the wardrobe, but it is also its own fully formed world with a map, history, culture and magic all of its own, allowing the author to play with elements of high fantasy. Camp Half-Blood in the Percy Jackson series can only be found by magical beings or demigods, similar to Hogwarts, Platform 9 3/4, or Diagon Alley in Harry Potter only being able to be found by wizards. And yet all of these are part of the real contemporary world, allowing fantastical things to happen within their borders, whilst also allowing the protagonists to explore contemporary Earth as well. Oz is an interesting case. Is it a world within a world, accessible via the tornado? Or is it a different world entirely? Or is it merely a dream? Each of these have benefits for the writer, but a possibility of all of the above together allow flexibility with the rules. Now, you may be wondering why someone would choose one of these settings above another, and we will consider the pros and cons of each in turn, along with a few examples. So, for an entirely fictional, high fantasy setting, there are many pros, and this is the option which I chose when developing my own fantasy trilogy, The Phantasm Chronicles. I wanted my concept for an all-powerful race of beings called phantasms to have an air of mystery, but also to not seem overly unbelievable. It needed to feel organic, and that is the big benefit of creating your own world and your own rules. It of course depends on your unique concept and whether you feel it would fit better with entirely new histories, geographies and physics, as fantastical elements are a lot easier for readers to swallow and accept without scepticism or disbelief in a fictional world, which can otherwise pull readers out of the story and make it feel unrealistic if they were placed in our world. The downside of this setting, of course, is that it takes an awful lot of world building to make it feel genuine and lived in. This is personally the most exciting part of writing a story for me, but there are a lot of elements to perfect to make your world feel real, and of course, this makes your characters feel real and relatable. There's a reason why Middle-earth feels so fantastic, with its history, languages, customs and races, all working in harmony to pull the reader in and immerse them entirely. Low fantasy is almost the opposite of this. In regards to world building, you as an author can draw upon your own personal experiences, write what you know, and make your descriptions and details so much deeper as a result. It also allows your reader to feel more at home in your story and to relate to the main character, who can often be portrayed as a fish out of water, the everyman who can experience the fantasy elements of the plot alongside the reader and make the experience easier to relate to. The potential difficulty with low fantasy, of course, is that the more fantastical elements of your plot can be more difficult to simply accept and require a lot more justification to explain them. Readers might question why these features are not more common knowledge in our world and how they can go by unnoticed by everyday people. An example of low fantasy working well is Harry Potter, where his initial ignorance of the world of magic allows us to discover it alongside him, and his presence in our familiar world can create many opportunities for comparisons of wizards and muggles. J.K. Rowling also borrowed elements from the third style of world building by having places only accessible by the wizards where magic could take place in secret and avoid the potentially jarring disbelief of the reader that this could go by unnoticed in our world. The third option, the parallel, alternative or pocket world, could be seen as a middle ground between the two, as it allows the writer to use the best features of both and cherry pick the elements which work best for their story. It also allows travel between worlds, which can often lead to an interesting experience of a protagonist from our world exploring the new high fantasy world alongside the reader and immersing them in the story so much more. A potential downside to this approach is the need to explain the link between worlds, the physics or magic involved, which of course may be a key element of your story and in fact be a strength of choosing this reason. Moving on from this episode and into the future, we're going to be looking at these three different types of fantasy world in a little bit more detail, starting with how to successfully build a high fantasy world, including culture, races, laws of physics, geography, maps, a shared history between those cultures, all of those different things that really come together to make that high fantasy world feel lived in and those characters believable. By the end of this series, the aspiring author should be able to go on that journey all the way through from initial concept right up to the finest points in editing, of cover design, and beyond. It should be a one-stop shop for somebody who really wants all of those tips, skills and tricks to be able to build their own fantasy novel. This channel was inspired by my own experiences of writing a high fantasy series, The Phantasm Chronicles, the first of which, The Call of the Cardinal, is available on Amazon now. The link is in the description and I would highly encourage anyone to give it a go if they love high fantasy reading or writing. Follow me on Twitter by checking out my link at MacMowood and make sure to like, subscribe and to leave me a comment telling me what you think. I'm very excited to continue this series and I hope that you are too. So, until next time, I have been McClellan Morwood, this has been The Fantasy Workbench, and I will see you in the next chapter.